Hello, thinkers. Welcome back to another episode. We've got Jodell Onstott, who's been with us, and she's written the book YHWH Exists and has been in other films, so Patterns of Evidence, and she's talking about the covenant. So let's get back to it. One thing, Jodell, that I tried to portray is this marriage relationship, because it says that the Israelites entered into like a marriage covenant at Mount Sinai. It basically says when the nation decides to go after other gods, it's like adultery, right? So you want to talk a little bit about that, this marriage relationship that God has with these people?
So throughout the scriptural text, it talks about God wooing Israel in the wilderness. He says, I betrothed you to me, and, I wooed you to me. Think of everything that God did at the Exodus for Israel. He sent plagues. He took them through the Red Sea. He delivered them. He provided manna. He did everything that the nation needed. When you look at the law that God gave, the divine law that God gave to ancient Israel, that cannot be kept unless you have a land in which to live it. And that's what God gave them. Not only did he give them a way of life that worked, he gave them a land where they could keep it. Everything that a man would do for a woman and trying to win that woman over and expressing, tokens of love and sincerity and everything that could be done, Yahweh, God, did for ancient Israel. And you find that is something, whether you look at Hosea or Jeremiah, that relationship of covenant, entering into that covenant, is something that's very sacred, it's very special, and it is something that joins God to Israel, and this, it isn't just that Yahweh is Israel's only God. It's the fact that Israel is the only people that God has chosen to work through at that time period, with the idea that they would bring other nations into that obedience too. But it is only the nation of Israel that Yahweh chooses to work with. So it's this very monogamous relationship that they are each expected to uphold the terms of the covenant and abide by them.
What does it mean to be chosen? In other words, if the Jews are God's chosen people?
To be chosen means that when God works with you, there is a standard. And Isaiah talks about God's judgments being shown in the earth. So when you are God's chosen people, it is a way for us to test, does God keep his word? Does God do what he's going to say he's going to do? And that history, we want to look at the here and now, but it's really in the past that we see how God's judgments have worked in the past, that we can test and see how these things have happened. So to be a chosen people, it means there is the responsibility of obedience, perhaps more so than other nations, because you are the one that has the spotlight on you. The spotlights aren't on the Greeks. The spotlights aren't on, Hindus. The spotlights are on you. So you are either going to live up to that standard, or when you don't, then the judgment for violating that standard will be seen. So being chosen requires a lot of responsibility. You have to have the courage to live up to that and to meet those stipulations. But then at the same time, when you do, there's just untold blessing that comes from that. And we see all of those stages with Israel living by the covenant, having the blessings from a way of life that works versus when they depart from it. So again, it comes down to that direct correlation.
What do you think is going on right now in Israel? I'm just curious, because this is a hot potato. A lot of people don't want to talk about, I think they call it eschatology, end times, things. But we're in the midst of what could lead to, a world war with other players becoming involved. I think it's important for us to know the context. And maybe it's not a question you want to answer, but how do you understand the signs of the times?
Let me just start off with saying that everything that has occurred the last year, over a year, has been absolutely horrific. I cannot imagine, and I have many, many friends who live in Israel. They've lost friends, they've lost relatives, whether on October 7th or afterwards in the ongoing campaigns. But when I look at the history of God's judgments, when I look at the history of the scriptural text, I do see that when a nation, and I'm not talking about individuals, I'm talking about the overall aggregate nation, there's a direct correlation between living righteously, sanctifying that covenant, versus turning your back on it and engaging in lifestyles or engaging in other things, injustice, that take you and where you no longer have that protection. I mean, the enemies are always there, but the promise is that if you are in covenant, you will have protection. So when I'm stuck with very difficult things, I do indeed side with God's judgments are still righteous. And this would be, even if there were judgment in my own life, in my own family, then I am always looking for, where have we gone astray? Where have we departed? And I take that position because in my research, I have seen such a direct correlation between God's righteousness and how he judges righteously. And he's not arbitrary, that I have to look for the causes. And that is how I usually interpret and how I process, even in the modern world, these occurrences.
Do you see any of these things connecting to an end times scenario here?
I see cycles of world history. I see cycles of righteousness. I see cycles of people depart from God's way of life and they fall into, behaviors of sin. And then you find that it becomes a time of oppression. And as these times of oppression occur, you find they create a more righteous generation oftentimes. Deuteronomy 32 is the Song of Moses is really good, talking about how, Israel kicks, they rebel once they gain prosperity. And you find many nations, they gain prosperity and they rebel, and then the hardships come and the hardships lead to repentance. So the question becomes, is this a final cycle? People call this the Titler cycle because it's a process that occurs over and over again. So is this a final time where we're either going to have a final judgment? The prophets have this vision that one day we will vanquish sin. We will get so tired of hitting our head upon that proverbial wall and doing the same thing over and over again that we will finally, Deuteronomy 30 says, you'll actually come back and you will obey and he will establish you in the land. Israel's in the land, but this messianic era of obedience, of living according to God's way of life, that hasn't occurred yet. So, at what point will God return? And that is a question that I don't think I'm qualified to answer.
I've talked to some rabbis that said that Israel has returned to the land, many of them, but they haven't returned to their God. If you just look at history repeating itself, and if you are a believer and you see God acting in history and you see that it seems like most of the time the kingdom of Israel wasn't serving God. They were worshiping other things. And that was the battle that they've faced. And they're kind of an example for all of us, I think, in this battle between, do we acknowledge who is the creator and do we obey? Now, there's a lot from the book of Genesis and for a believer up to Revelation that you've got to consider here. So I think what I'm hearing you saying is that a lot of these troubles or woes have come partly due to the fact that many of them don't necessarily acknowledge that there is a God. There's a lot of different beliefs going on. I know there's verses that talk about at one time they'll understand, their eyes will be open, and they'll come back to the God of their forefathers.
And that is what I see is, when you look at the broad paradigm, there are a lot of texts that state that Israel will return, that Israel will get tired of her sins, and that eventually it will become a righteous nation. And that, of course, coincides with God's return to the earth. That, I think, is a hope that almost every believer has, is the hope in God's return and that the future will be better. I do think that there is a caution in that, though, because I think in our comfortability, we think, oh, that's off in the future. We can put that off till tomorrow, rather than saying, what can I do today? What can I do right now to fulfill that vision, that prophetic vision? And this is where I think each of us are ambassadors, and each of us can do good today. We can all become obedient, and we can all become a light to the nations just simply by doing it. And then I think you have so much joy and peace that comes from it as well. When I look at Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, that being the consequences of either obeying the covenant or disobeying it, right there you see God's judgments. And you can go through history. You can chart that in history in the Bible with Kings and Chronicles and the fulfillment of that. You can also look at Assyrian inscriptions and different epigraphic evidence that we have, and you can see the fulfillment of God's covenant, that there's blessings and there's eras of peace. And then there are definitely times of oppression. There's times of judgment and persecution when people disobey. And I think we always try to make excuses for that. We always try to rationalize it with other causes and other reasons. But I think when we just get back to the basics, it becomes very clear and simple, and it's not that difficult.
As you were talking about that, I was thinking, the Israelites are sort of, the microscope is on them, the Jewish people throughout the centuries. But what we haven't realized is that all of us, in many ways, will be held accountable for what we do. And now there are sometimes good people that seem like they've gone through very, very difficult times, and there's other bad people that seem like they're really blessed and they've got a great, easy life. But there's more to this story than just that. And I think that the Israel dilemma, as we look at it, if we go back to it again, it's going to be in theaters on November 13th, 14th. That's a Wednesday and Thursday. And then on the 17th, which is a Sunday. Once again, why would you say this is an important film for people to see?
A rational faith, a faith based on facts and based on evidence, helps you from being led astray or from being, I say, gaslit by others who say there's no reason to believe this, or they say there is no evidence. When you see the Patterns of Evidence films, you get scholarly facts, you get knowledge, and it is something that allows you to build a faith based on a vast array of evidence that I think it just makes you a more well-rounded person, but it also makes you stronger because you can stand on your own 2 feet versus just relying on somebody else who's told you something. For me, I know anytime that I go and I read in a description myself, I see the evidence for myself, I am so much stronger in my belief system. And, it's amazing that you have put this together, that you have brought it to people so that way they can consider it. And I think it's an amazing film that will really, really strengthen people's faith.
Well, thank you. When I think about, growing in your faith, you had a crisis of faith. I had a crisis of faith too. And my crisis came later on in life. I was in my 40s when it happened. And one of the things I think that these films are, and any kind of research that helps people, is that as you grow deeper and deeper and you plant in roots into your faith and you go, look, this happened here. There are times when you never thought you would have unbelief, but something happens. Maybe it's a tragedy. Maybe it's a broken marriage. Maybe it's something that happens with, you get cancer. And now you're just wondering, well, why? What's this all about? I don't know what it'd be like to live if you did not have the confidence that we have in the Bible and these events. For some reason, God called me and you and a few others to investigate this past. And I think one of the reasons it's so important is because I just heard a testimony, once again, someone who went off to college, even at a college that had a Christian label on it, an Old Testament studies, and basically they were told in that class that none of this ever happened. There's no evidence, and that person's faith was very, very shaken to the point where they couldn't even read the Bible practically. But what ends up happening is that there are schools and universities that people have come to the conclusion that there's no evidence and they don't want to look for any because there's a way they want to dismiss the Bible. Some people say, well, why do you need evidence? I just have faith. Well, that works for some people, but doesn't work for everybody. And I've met them, and they needed a little bit to help them, get through. And guess what? There is an enormous pattern of evidence, and that's in this new movie, The Israel Dilemma. And it's a 2-part film. The second part will be coming out next year, God willing. So anyway, Jodell, thank you. Any final thoughts you want to share?
Well, I will say, I do believe that one of the reasons why scholars undermine the text so much is that the text itself is a mechanism of accountability. And the one thing that I have learned, whether it is a pastor, teacher, rabbi, politician, nobody wants accountability. So if you are going to give credence to the text, that means you're going to be held accountable to a standard. That means you need to live a certain lifestyle. It means that you have to treat people a certain way. And I think a lot of people kind of have this standoffishness where they think if they ignore the evidence, they ignore the patterns of those evidence, that it'll just go away. They won't be affected by it. But I see it as the way of life that it can really bring peace and unity and heal our very divided world. Because when we can agree, when we can say, this is strong evidence, this is strong evidence, look, Tiglath-Pileser lived here, we have King Uzziah, we have all of these kings, Sargon, Sennacherib, and their interactions with Israel occurred at the very time the Bible says they do. Well, when we have all of those reasons and we have all of those facts, then it allows us to actually embrace the philosophy, the teaching, the religion, the religious ideas that the Bible teaches. And I think that gives us a very, very strong foundation for our faith.
People don't want to be held accountable to what the greater understanding of the text is. And in order to feel comfortable with that, you have to dismiss the text historically, archaeology, or whatever. And if you can dismiss that, then you can say, I don't have to be underneath the ruling of what this scripture is telling me or how to live. And the Bible is telling us that this nation, God chose them, and he's been working with them throughout history. As an observer of history, you realize that God is moving some chess pieces around here, or something's going on, and that's why we need to pay attention.
And to your point, even though God chose Abraham and his family, that did not eliminate his care for other nations, because he did send Jonah to Nineveh to warn them of the consequences of their ways. So it's not like it's just this myopic, view of Israel, because there is interaction with other nations. It's just as far as the covenants are concerned, and as you pointed out, the pattern of the violation of those covenants, the persecution, and the blessings of those covenants with the obedience. I think that's one great way that we are able to find God in history, and just be able to trust in the text itself.
Rabbi Hartman, said when I interviewed him, it's not that you can just go off and do whatever you want to do. There's things that you're supposed to do. It's a great responsibility. And I think that's where we'll leave it, is that there's a great responsibility here to be God's chosen people. And it's also on how you treat the foreigners. So there's a lot going on, and I'm glad I'm not God to try to figure it out. But I do believe we all need to pay attention to these things. And well, thank you, Jodell, for being a part of this. And thank you, thinkers, for hearing a little bit more about the Israel dilemma and what we're trying to, investigate. Keep on thinking.